the clear view of Wiltshire in the investigation is it was set up on the instructions of Mr. Graham Power, the Chief Officer of Police. He directed another officer to set it up, and that officer carried out instructions.
And is there any evidence at all that Bill Ogley and Frank Walker were involved?
Not in relation to the setting up of Operation Blast. The finding of Wiltshire was that they were not involved in relation to that and didn't know about it.
And what was actually in the files?
What was in the files depended upon individual people. In the case of each, when you're saying files, it's like a what we would call not a box file, a sort of paper file with multiple different parts to it, and each section of it corresponded with an individual. Now, in each section was the criminal record of the individual states member, plus some information about them, like a photograph and so on and so forth. Any information which had been obtained from national intelligence on them, and then individual information relating to cases in which they'd come to the attention of the police. Some of those were because they'd been complainants about something, but the majority were where they had been found doing something untoward, or the police had thought they'd done something untoward.
And is there ever any evidence that any of these files were ever used for anything?
There's not evidence that they were used, either set up or used to undermine the democratic process. What seems to have happened was the information was being put in there, it was being collated for use later, but actually there isn't evidence that it was actually used in an untoward way.
And how were the files overseen? I mean, that seems to have been one of the main problems, essentially.
Well, that appears to be very sloppy indeed. They seem to have been just set up. Items of obviously there was this initial decision to set them up, this initial decision to obtain criminal records on each person, which is totally and utterly improper to do that. There was no justification for that whatsoever, and the other checks. But after that, it seems to have been a very ad hoc basis that individual officers would send information to a particular person to say, look, can you put it in the file that you're keeping? But it seems to have been very ad hoc because there doesn't seem to be a process of weeding out. In fact, general data protection principles were just totally overlooked or ignored.
Now, in terms of the background for the creation of these files, I mean, Graham Power had been trying to get a vetting system introduced for politicians, and the report, to a degree, also suggests that he did identify a possible weakness in the system.
Yes.
Is there a case for a vetting system actually being needed?
Well, there needs to be a mature discussion of this. I mean, my own personal view is there's a relatively simple way by which the declarations which are made by states members of their previous criminal records could be checked. And if they had made a false declaration, that would come to the knowledge of the public prior to the actual election. I think that could happen quite simply. But the issue of a more detailed process of vetting than just criminal records is more complicated. It doesn't sit very happily with the current ministerial system because people are appointed too soon. In a sense, we don't know who the Chief Minister is going to be until a Monday of a particular week, and then we're starting to vote on the actual ministers on the Thursday, so there isn't time. What has happened in some cases informally, and for instance in Home Affairs, both the previous minister and assistant minister and myself and Jackie Hilton have agreed to be vetted and to go through national checks so that we could receive information that came through the national system as well as local information. But that was entirely because we agreed to do that. And I suppose we could operate a sort of voluntary system, but the trouble would be what would happen if you found something as a result of that. Who's going to make the decision that that's a ground for removing somebody? So there needs to be a mature discussion about it.
Now, a question perhaps quite a few people will have after the information in these reports comes out is how such senior police officers could have so little knowledge of data protection law.
Well, I don't think it's just that. I mean, the most serious thing, I think, is that they had made approaches, or Mr. Power had made approaches to politicians to set something up. They didn't agree to it, and he seems to have gone and done it anyway. That I find the most disturbing, because to me that indicates, frankly, that he was out of control. I mean, the fact is that these were files which were dealt with as secret files. They were put in the most secret part of the state's records, and I suspect they knew they shouldn't be doing it.
How serious a breach of data protection law would you say that this constituted?
I think it's pretty serious because the propensity for undermining democracy was there. I mean, there's no evidence that it actually happened. But let us say that at some stage later that there might hypothetically have been a particular politician annoying the police. The propensity for them to say, right, we're now going to look at what we've got on this particular person and we're going to leak it to some other hostile politician in order to try and take this person out of play is really extremely worrying. I'm not saying that happened, I'm not saying they ever had the intention, but the potential for that existed, and that's very serious indeed.
Now, there's also an accountability question to be answered now by 3 senior police officers. Will a disciplinary action follow now?
Well, there are officers, there's a situation where some of the officers have left, some of the more senior ones who are involved have left. In relation to officers who may still remain, that's a matter for the senior management of the police. I don't get involved directly in disciplinary matters of that nature. That'll be for them to decide. There is a recommendation, as you've seen, for disciplinary action against the first tier and the second tier of people, but really not against the third tier, who are reckoned to have been so junior that they were just carrying out instructions. Nevertheless, there's an issue in relation to education and training on data protection. It's quite notable, quite interesting, that this came to light once a new officer came in to head up Special Branch. He looked at this and he said this isn't right and drew it to the attention of the acting chief. That's how it came out in the first place.
What do you hope will come out of this report? What do you hope will be the consequence?
Well, there's going to be better training for the police in relation to this, and also officers have got to be given the freedom to challenge their senior people if it's wrong. I'm afraid that in the days of Mr. Power, in particular days of Mr. Harper, who didn't seem to brook any dissent whatsoever, that officers were just frightened to challenge their seniors, even if there were grounds. You know, they've got to have the freedom to do that in an appropriate way. But I think that we do need to look at some of the issues in terms of, in fact, there's a recommendation from Wiltshire that we actually look at having some sort of vetting system. If we ever became an independent island, which is not impossible, then we would have to have our own national security. Now, my own view is that should not be done by individual ministers or by the chief minister or whatever. That if we're going to have some sort of system, it should be openly debated in the states and should be subject to statute and so on, so that everybody knows what's happening and what the safeguards are.